Hi, I'm Jerry Barmash. If you are like me from New York City, from the area, you've likely heard my next guest, who's been on the radio for, I want to say, a few decades, several decades, many decades, more than 4 decades. It's amazing. We're actually closing in on a half century that we have heard Bernie Wagenblast giving traffic and transit updates on some of the biggest stations in New York. And so, yeah, he certainly has been a fixture on New York radio over the years. And more recently, Bernie has transitioned to his new life as a woman. And we're going to talk to him today on Here Now the News. Bernie Wagenblast, thanks for joining me today. I really appreciate you coming on.
Oh, thank you so much, Jerry. Thank you for having me. Great to be here.
Yeah, I mean, we have known each other for many years. I was at Shadow for about 5 years. You go back to it. We were just chatting before we started to the beginning days of Shadow traffic. It was, I couldn't believe it. It was 79. It goes back that far.
Yeah, just barely. December 3rd, 1979 was our debut.
Wow. What stations were there then?
We were on virtually every radio station in New York and the suburbs because it was a much different time. We were on NBC, ABC, CBS, WINS, WNEW, AM and FM. You know, you name the station, and we were even WQXR.
How many people were part of the staff?
I think we had about 7 on-air traffic reporters, and we had a bunch of people who were producers, who were drivers, pilots, flying over the city, spotters. So probably a staff of close to 30.
For those who don't know, and it started in New York, I guess in New Jersey, was it still at that point?
Well, Shadow itself started in Philadelphia a few years before they opened in New York. They then opened in Chicago, and the New York office, which, as you say, was actually in New Jersey when it opened, was the location.
And it became, I don't know if they were all connected all over the country, but they had these, if not Shadow, certainly variations of it in other markets.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there was another company. Our big competitor back in the day was a company called Metro Traffic. So between Shadow and Metro, they were in almost every major market and even some very small markets doing traffic reports.
And again, I think most people at this point know what Shadow traffic is, or the if not the term, certainly the what it stood for or what it did. And as you've already alluded to, it was a way for stations, radio, and then of course TV, to provide other elements to their not just newscasts, FM to music to other formats. And primarily it was traffic, and then it was, I guess, certainly news, even on certain stations, sports, and it really it exploded over the coming decades.
Yeah, when I talk to somebody who is too young to remember the days before the internet and smartphones, I would say radio was kind of our smartphone back in the day. It was where you would turn on and what you would turn on to get the news headlines, the weather, the traffic reports, the sports scores, all those things that we can get from our phone now on demand. You turned on the radio and listened to there. And of course, music and companionship and all the other things that radio offered.
Yeah, it's a very good point. I mean, it's the same thing with TV. Like now there's, in the hundreds of channels. And in those days, it was the 3 major channels and then the few other independent channels. And it was, that's why when you came to the news at night, it was so important to get the audience, because there was, it was at 5, or even when there were 4, 5, 6, and 11. It was really vying for the audience, for the whether it was news at that time or the other shows. And you see it with radio as well. One of the big radio stations in this era, although it was winding down by the time we're talking about 79 and into the 80s, was at least at that format, was music radio WABC.
Mhm.
And you were I don't know if you mentioned WABC. Did you, as one of those early stations?
I think I just yeah, I mentioned it in passing as I was going through call letters.
Well, I started to say before we went on the air, when was the last time we met? We had worked at Shadow. I was there for, like I said, a 5 year period early in the 2000s. And we met the last time, and it was, speaking of WABC, it was the public memorial for Dan Ingram in
Oh, yes. Mhm.
2018, I believe that was. And I think you had a little anecdote you told me then. Could you share about working with Dan Ingram a little?
Sure. Well, the way Shadow worked, the reporters were on multiple radio stations and you had a schedule. So, 1 minute I would be on 1010 Winds, and then another minute I would be on a suburban station in New Jersey, another one on Long Island, but I was also on WABC. And I think WABC, first of all, they wanted to have someone who is exclusively on their station. Plus, Bernie Wagenblast doesn't exactly sound like a top 40 name. So Dan Ingram, the legendary Dan Ingram, had just recently moved to mornings from his usual spot in afternoons that he had done for years. And I came on about a week or so after he had moved to mornings. And Dan decided that the name he was going to give me was Jack Packard. So when I would do a shadow traffic report, I would always close it out. This is Jack Packard, WABC Shadow Traffic. Well, one Monday morning, my very first report of the week, I must have been still half asleep. I came to the outro on the traffic report and I blurted out, "I'm Bernie Wagenblast." And soon as the words left my mouth, I knew I had screwed up. And I'm thinking, again, I was in my early 20s. I have just ruined my career. I am going to be fired from this job. And that was the end of it. It totally caught Dan off guard, which was great. One of the very few times that someone cracked him up on the air where he was having a hard time holding it together. And he made light of it. I obviously lived to broadcast another day, but that was perhaps one of the greatest mistakes I had ever made on the air. And it still lives on. If you go on YouTube and search "Traffic Reporter Forgets His Own Name," you can actually hear that clip and a little bit of the background of where Jack Packard came from.
That's great. And obviously you stayed put with WABC, right?
Yeah, I stayed there. I think, about 6 months or so on WABC because they then did some shifts. And at the time, I was just doing WABC during morning drive, and an afternoon drive, I switched over to 1010 Winds. So Winds wanted me to go on during morning drive. So I left WABC and then was doing Winds exclusively as far as a New York City station.
And how long were you on Wins? Because I think most people remember you, and obviously how popular Wins has been over the years, know you from there.
I was on Winds. I had two stints on Winds. My first one was from 1979 to about 1985. Then I left the world of traffic reporting. And some 23 years later, I came back and I had another, maybe 7, 8 years that I was on Winds. Some of that was just part time, but I had a short midday shift. When I came back, I jokingly described it to the radio television reporter for the Daily News as the world's longest lunch break in radio. That I was gone for a lunch break. And I also described myself as the Rip Van Winkle of traffic reporting because when I left, this was before the internet. We were using spotters with binoculars on the World Trade Center and the Empire State Building. There were no such things as traffic cameras back in the day. We had helicopters and airplanes that we were using. And then by the time I came back, now you had maps that showed you what traffic was like. You had traffic cameras that were all over the tri-state area. You had all these resources, and it was a little bit of an adjustment. Everything was analog when I left. When I came back, everything was digital.
Wow, that really, it must have been, was it a little overwhelming that did you have to like get up to speed quickly? Because it's
Yeah,
a fast paced environment.
Yeah, it took, a day or two before I felt comfortable back again. But it's, the old saying of it's like riding a bicycle. Once I got back into it, I felt very comfortable, but it was a little bit of an adjustment switching from just doing everything analog to now having all these other resources that you had at your fingertips.
When we saw each other in, as I said, the Dan Ingram Memorial in 2018, at least as far as I know, you hadn't begun the transition yet. When did that start?
It started quietly in 2017, but it really was invisible to anybody else. And I certainly was not sharing this with the world at the time. But the big moment for me was a little over 3 years ago, January 1st of 2023 was when I socially transitioned. And that was really the major difference. A lot of the other stuff, like I say, was kind of behind the scenes and people didn't notice. But as of January 1st, 2023, that was when I started living as a woman and letting everybody else in the world know that that was how I was going to be living my life.
Right, and that's when you posted it, I'm sure on Facebook, and really began to. What it was? What did you need in those three? What was it? 3 years, 4 years before you told the world? What was it? A matter of getting the support from family, friends? What did you need in those few years?
It was a few different things. For some of it was making sure that this was the right thing for me to do. I did not want to jump into that without getting a sense that this was something that I needed to do. It was alerting people that were my clients that this was going to be going on and to make sure that they were on board with it. I had obviously told family long before it became public, so they were already aware of what was going on. And then finally, it was just getting up my confidence to the point where I felt comfortable making this kind of a major move. It's there's nothing in my life that was as big or as dramatic as changing genders.
When something like that, as you say, you have to decide and you have to really take your time. And what were there moments? And I'm not trying to pry and get personal, but were there moments earlier in your life when you, if not thought about it, but that you look back now and can say, okay, this is the path I was going on?
I knew from my earliest memories that I felt I was a girl. So it was
Okay.
not a sudden revelation about I'm not comfortable with my gender. I've always known that. But I grew up in the 1960s and the 1970s, and I couldn't see any viable path of transitioning. So I really poured myself into radio. That was what I loved, and I wanted to be on the radio. So that was my distraction. But I think what happened is as I got older, I'm in my 60s, that I felt that if I was ever going to do this, the time was now. And I didn't want to come to the end of my life and have regret about never having done this. It was
Hmm.
something that was pervasive in my thoughts. I thought about this all the time. I've said, and I don't think this is an exaggeration, there was not one waking moment of my life from childhood up until when I socially transitioned that I did not think about being a girl or being a woman. So it was something that was always there. I likened it, the best analogy that I can think of is when you get a splinter and you can't quite get it out, it's there. You still can go on, you still can go to work, you can still do things, but you feel it every time you touch that finger, let's say, to a table, you're reminded that it's there. And that's what being trans was like for me. It was something I was constantly aware of, but it didn't stop me from living my life and moving through my life.
So you didn't know. I mean, you knew, but you didn't know that you were going to actually officially transition, even though you knew it, that you were, as you say, a woman or a girl from the early from your earliest memories. You didn't know how you would how you would take hold of that.
Hmm.
And even if you would, like you said, when you were older, when you got into your 60s, but you didn't necessarily have it planned for when you were in your 60s, right?
No, no, I had no idea, up through my 50s and early 60s that this would ever happen, because I also knew that if I did this, that it could mean the end of my career, it could mean the end of my marriage, it could mean a lot of things. And someone who an older trans woman who I talked to, oh, maybe 10 years or so before I transitioned, told me, "Don't transition unless you absolutely have to." And that was the point that I had reached, that I needed to do this. This was no longer something that I wanted to do, but something that I had to do. So I didn't know that I was going to transition until relatively a few months before I decided that I was going to socially transition. That was when I made the decision that this was going to happen.
I wasn't aware. So you were married at the time of this?
Yeah, I was married for over 40 years.
Wow, that's something. Yeah, I mean, all of these factors. I mean, I'm sitting here on the side, but there's so much of this. Weighing. It sounds silly, the pros and the cons, but it sounds from what you're saying that it was such a force that it was an unstoppable force. You had no choice. This was going to happen.
Yeah, I suppose you could always say there's a choice, but the choice, if I had not transitioned, would have been that the rest of my life would have been very, very painful and would not have been a life that I would have wanted to live.
And that's the most important thing,
Mhm.
that
Yeah.
you were um not to put words in your mouth, but you were honest with yourself and what you had to do for yourself.
Mhm. Yes, yes, very much so. It was, like I say, it was not an easy decision because I knew that there were a lot of things that would come about as a result of it, but overall, I have not regretted for a moment the decision that I made back in 2022.
And that support, your wife, your family, friends, all of that, did that help your, if not decision, but did that help you move forward?
Yes and no. I think even if there had not been support, I still would have done this. I don't think that this was contingent on anyone's support. It certainly would have been much more difficult,
Sure.
but it was not something that I would have changed my mind saying, "Oh, well, there's too many negatives here. I can't do this."
So let me ask you, you started out, there were those few years, and for no excuse and no reason you shouldn't be, but it was a very private situation, a private matter, as well it should be.
Mhm.
It's that person's life, and they are the ones that have to make the decisions until they're comfortable coming out and coming forward. Now you've done a 180. Is it a 180? Yeah, 180. And you've decided, not only are you out with it and no longer private, but you seem to be, in effect, speaking for the trans community. Is that a fair statement?
Oh, without a doubt, that is a fair statement. When I posted my coming out note on social media, I had said I hope to be an educator. My background obviously was in communications. Communicating is something I am very comfortable doing. I was a reporter, still am to some degree a reporter about transportation news. So I felt that I was qualified to be a person who could share their story with the media and with others. I figured when I transitioned that there might be some local interest in this story. And that was really all I anticipated, especially come June, because June is Pride Month. So there tends to be a lot of news coverage of LGBTQ plus related stories during June. But I guessed that come July 1st and the end of Pride Month, that the story would kind of disappear. And my educating would be mainly within my community, people I knew, things like that. But I was blown away by the interest that was shown in my story, first on a local level and then on a national and even international level, that there was this deep level of interest in hearing more about it. I think some of that goes back to something we haven't talked about yet, my notoriety as one of the voices of the New York City subway,
Right.
and how my voice was transitioning from a one that people were very familiar with and had known to this voice that you're hearing now. But it was also a little bit about the person behind that voice, that, we hear these voices all throughout the day and we really don't necessarily give them much thought. But this was a story that delved into much more than just a voice actor that is performing. This was something that they found to be very interesting.
We'll get right back to the podcast. But first, I want to tell you about my book, Here Now the News. I spoke to dozens of industry professionals for a fun look at the TV news business in New York. Here Now the News is entertaining and enlightening, with dozens of stories about the legends who delivered the news night after night. Pick up your copy on Amazon, available in paperback, Kindle, and my own narrated audiobook version. Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up about this. Excuse me, the subways. I mean, that's something else I wanted to bring up, and it's true because this longtime voice, whether on radio or in the subway, but as you said, much more than a voice. There's a lot more to a person than a voice. Some people, of course, we primarily only know you as the voice, and now. And thanks to you being so open about it, we know a lot more about you. And do you think that, well, first of all, it's sort of a two-part question. Did you have any role model during the transition with anyone in the trans community?
I would say a few different people. The first one was a teacher in New Jersey. This was when I was 14 years old. She was in the news because she had transitioned, and it was very controversial. This was the early 1970s to have someone transition, particularly a teacher, and she wanted to come back and continue teaching. And the Board of Education in this community was debating that, and people were making decisions about, is this right? Is this wrong? A lot of things like that. And I reached out to her. And again, keep in mind, this is the days before the internet. So I mailed her a letter, and we made arrangements for her to give me a call at a payphone near my house. I rode my bike up to the payphone one evening and talked to her. So she was sort of the first role model. And then as I got older and trans people became more visible, there were other people that I looked up to. I wouldn't say any one individual. I would look at different people and different aspects of their transition. I would try to adopt which felt comfortable to me. So there might be one aspect of how they transitioned, or maybe if there was someone who had a career similar to mine, that I would look at that. So there were a lot of different pieces that I looked at then before I socially transitioned, and still to this day look at and say, oh, there's something that I can relate to, and I can learn something from that person.
And on the other side of that, I'm sure you have people who have, you are a role model for them. And how does that make you feel?
It is very humbling. I have seen, as my story has been shared and in comments that come from people I have never met and likely will never meet in person, that this helps them, if they are a trans person, to feel seen, because they are still hearing my voice perhaps 2 times a day as they go to and from work or school, on the subway, and that they are identifying with the person behind that voice now that they know who is the person that is performing that voice. The voice that you hear on the subway is still what I call my guy voice or my subway voice. It's not this voice, but they're hearing that and they now know that it is a trans woman who is performing that voice. So that means a lot. And to hear comments like iconic or queen or things of that sort just really mean a lot to me. It makes me feel, like I say, humbled that I am in such a visible position. And it also feels as if there's a great responsibility. It's sort of like that line at the beginning, I think, of the first Spider-Man movie, where, with great power comes great responsibility. Well, with great visibility comes great responsibility as well, in my mind. So I feel I have great responsibility to share my story, to articulate it well, and to share it where it's appropriate.
Uh, yeah, I mean, it's well said. I want to ask, given the situation right now, the climate in this country, um, is there concern where the future of gay rights, trans rights, there seems to be a concern that in Washington, the Trump administration is trying to uh, turn the clock back, if you will, on these rights. Where do you, how do you, where do you go forward with this? How do what is the concern right now? Let's go with that.
There is great concern on the part of the trans community. Not only are they trying, but they have already succeeded in
Yeah.
turning the clock back in
Yeah.
many respects. For example, two things that come to mind: trans people in the military have had to leave if they have come out, so they are no longer part of the military. And I have a friend who had to retire from the military. She was a colonel in the US Space Force, and she did not wish to leave, but she was forced to leave. And there were many others as well who I don't know as well. And passports is another example where, under previous administrations, we were allowed to change the gender marker on our passports to reflect the gender that we identify as and as we present. And under the current administration, that is no longer allowed. So those are just two examples. And then you have the difference between which state you're in. What I can do as a resident of New Jersey, or if I were in New York, is much different than what I would be allowed to do in a state such as Texas or Florida. So there are those elements as well, with what are we allowed to do? What will the government try to do? There's very much a feeling, I think, on the part of the trans community that the federal government and many state governments are basically trying to erase trans people and make it
Mhm.
so that we cannot continue to exist publicly um, in the current environment. Everything from, like I say, passports, birth certificates, driver's licenses, things of those sort, that they are changing the rules on. And even things like medical care, because they use the power of the purse strings. Almost everybody in the United States, every organization, to some degree or another, is dependent on federal funding. So they just will threaten to take away federal funding if they don't get the cooperation of hospitals and medical people and things of that sort. And that's a tremendous power that they have.
I hate to even ask this, but is leaving this country at any point on the table for you?
It's something I've certainly thought about in the back of my mind. What I've done is I feel that I am going to stay in this country as long as I can safely do so. And that's for a couple of reasons. First of all, I don't want to leave behind those who are not as privileged as I am and don't have the means to leave the country. But second, I also, I'm old enough to remember the 1960s and the civil rights movement. And we're recording this on Martin Luther King Day. And I think of Martin Luther King Jr., and he did not leave the country, and the other civil rights leaders at the time did not leave the country. They stayed and they fought, and in some cases, actually, with the case of Dr. King, gave their lives to protect their fellow citizens. So I feel that's the model that I'm going to try to emulate. Nonviolence, civil disobedience if necessary, but I don't want to leave unless it is absolutely necessary.
While the White House is certainly, progressive is not a word we would use for the White House,
Mhm.
this White House. But New York, the state, and certainly the city is, and that is with the latest administration, certainly Mayor Zoran Mamdani. And you had a little hand in his inauguration. Tell me about being the voice for the new mayor's inauguration recently.
Sure. Well, a few weeks before the inauguration, I got an email from someone on the transition team asking if I would be the announcer for his inauguration. I think there were two reasons that I was asked. Number one, being one of the voices of the subway, and transit is certainly a big part of his platform in terms of trying to improve transit. You can't talk about New York City without talking about transit because virtually everyone depends on it to some degree or another. And the second part was the fact that I am trans. And that is a group that he had voiced support for during the campaign. So I felt that I was a very visible way of demonstrating a connection to both transit and the transgender community. So I was amazed, astonished that they were asking me to take on this great responsibility. It was on January 1st in front of City Hall. There were some 4,000 people there in front of City Hall, but then thousands more who were doing a block party along Broadway where they had large screens and speakers to see and hear what was going on. And it was just an amazing moment for me. They gave me the opportunity to introduce myself at the beginning of the proceedings. So I was able to introduce myself. And when I mentioned my name, some people recognized that. But then I said something along the lines of, you might better recognize my voice from being on the subway. And I did my famous subway line of, please stand away from the platform edge. And that got a big cheer from the audience. So that was wonderful. I was the first person to ever publicly introduce the new mayor and his wife on January 1st. So that was a big moment. And it was just something that increased visibility tremendously because not only all the people who were there in lower Manhattan, but also the people who were watching online, on TV. It was being broadcast around the country. It was being broadcast, in fact, around the world because since the mayor was born in Uganda, his wife was from India, there was interest internationally to what was going on. And let's face it, New York is the international capital of the world. So there was great interest all over the world as to what was going on here. And it was a tremendous responsibility, a tremendous honor on my part to be able to do that.
Would you get into politics in any way, or would you work like in a task force or in any way with the mayor if asked?
I would say I try to stay away from partisan politics. I still consider myself a journalist. I do some transportation journalism through newsletters and podcasts. And I'm kind of old school when it comes to journalism. I always have felt that a journalist should not publicly advocate. However, I think there are some differences. So, for instance, if someone asked me and said, well, if you're a journalist, what were you doing announcing the inauguration? And my answer to that was, first of all, I saw it as a civic responsibility. And second, I was not announcing any political things. I was introducing people. That was my job on January 1st, was introducing people. If there are opportunities to serve on a task force or people seek out my opinion on something, I am more than happy to do that. But I still try to stay away from partisan politics of endorsing a particular candidate or a particular bill, with some exceptions, things that directly affect the transgender community. I will go out and support those. But I feel that it's more powerful for me to remain as much as possible above politics, because in my role as a journalist, I'm speaking to people from all different points of view. And I
Mhm.
don't want them to feel that I'm coming at it from a partisan viewpoint and things of that sort. And it also opens the door to having discussions with people who are open to different points of view. And sometimes, if you are wearing a label of Republican or Democrat, that door gets closed before you even get a chance to share anything.
Yeah, yeah, good point. Yeah, especially in the country, the world we're in right now, how there's such the divisive nature that we're in. What, as you just did the voice of the subway there, the with the gap there, is it the gap? Right, with the gap. Watch
It's,
the
well,
gap,
please stand away from the platform edge is
the
the line.
platform edge.
Yes.
How long have you been doing that? How long has that been your voice?
I did those recordings in 2009, so they have run continuously. You hear me primarily in the stations of the numbered lines for the New York City subway. Occasionally, some of my other safety announcements will run in other stations, but I'm also, for instance, the voice on the air train at Newark Liberty International Airport. I'm the voice on a line called Patco, which runs between South Jersey and Philadelphia. And I do some other transportation related voices as well. And now I'm doing a little bit of that even in show business.
What do you mean?
Well, in 2024, I was asked by Lin-Manuel Miranda to be the voice of the train conductor on his album called Warriors, which is sort of a musical retelling of the famous 1979 cult classic, The Warriors, about a gang from Coney Island that goes up to the Bronx and gets blamed for a murder they did not commit and have to go through a gauntlet of various gangs getting back to Coney Island. That was a big one to be asked by Lin-Manuel Miranda to be part of his next musical creation after Hamilton. Just totally blew my mind. How am I becoming part of a musical with Lin-Manuel Miranda and Issa Davis? It just was amazing. But I've also done a few other things. I was a voice on a Paramount Plus sitcom with Tracy Morgan called Crutch, where again I'm typecast as a train conductor, so I'm always doing train voices. I am rehearsing a musical that I'm going to be a part of. I made my debut off Broadway in September with Dylan Mulvaney's one-woman show called The Least Problematic Woman in the World. And these things just kind of keep happening. I am not seeking them out. They come to me to ask if I could do it. So I am just, again, honored that I get these opportunities to do these things. I never really thought of myself in show business beyond what I did on the radio.
Wow. I was going to ask you what's on the horizon. You have more of these moments?
They kind of come up unexpectedly.
Yeah.
I did not anticipate all of them, any of them, really. They just have come about. There was one in November. I was reading my email on Thanksgiving Day, and I got an email from the folks at Chanel saying, we're having a fashion show in the city, and we'd like you to come. And okay, that's great. I would love to come to the fashion show. But then they said, we would like to dress you. So I went into the city. They sent a car, brought me into the city, outfitted me in a Chanel outfit from head to toe, and was at the show as one of the people that was wearing their clothing that the paparazzi were taking pictures of. So I'm there with folks like Bowen Yang, formerly of Saturday Night Live, oh, John Bon Jovi was another person. There were a lot of celebrities there. And again, how is this that I am here with these kinds of folks doing something like this? So
Wow.
it is really, it's not planned. I don't know exactly what's coming up. The one thing I do know about is this musical that is in some early stages of being put together that I'm going to be a major character in. But I never know what's going to happen. So you can check back with me in a month or two, and who knows what new things will have come up.
Well, that's exciting, right?
Oh
That
yeah,
you have these brushes with fame. I mean, it's great that you're getting this celebrity, and you're able to enhance your visibility, which is so important.
it is. And again, that's the most important part for me, is that I am just so privileged to be asked to do these things because of my notoriety from the New York City subway, that that has opened up so many doors that wouldn't have happened otherwise. So that was really the key thing for me, was being asked to be one of the voices of the subway. And again, almost every New Yorker and many people from not only the tri-state area, but really from around the world, when they come to New York, they take the subway. So they
Yeah.
hear and they know my voice.
Was it? I just wanted to ask you, the voice, the subway. Was it important to keep that familiarity of the voice and your name?
I'm not sure I completely understand in terms of the familiarity, but um, even before I came out and transitioned, there was still some notoriety that came about because of being one of the voices of the subway. Perhaps the craziest thing was in 2012, the New York Times had asked me to do some fantasy announcements that readers had suggested. So we recorded announcements that you would not hear on the subway, including one piece, which was a subway rap, which I was very hesitant because I am not a rapper, obviously. And they did enough work with it to make me sound passable as an amateur rapper. And that in and of itself was pretty amazing. But then a few years later, I'm sitting where I'm sitting right now, and my phone started blowing up with messages. And it was messages like, "Oh, my daughter just came home from taking the PSAT, and you're in it." And I had no idea what they were talking about, but I started digging around a little, and I found out that in the reading comprehension section of the PSAT that year, this was 2016, they had used that story from the New York Times as part of the reading comprehension section. Obviously rewrote it, but they used my name, and all these kids from around the country were reading about me that afternoon. And then there were all these memes that were created. So again, things that if I had had the best manager in the world, they could not have arranged these things that have happened. These have just kind of happened organically, that these opportunities come up.
And as far as your name, you wanted to, again, I'm going to say familiarity, because they know that voice and they know that name, and you wanted to keep that.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of reasons. First of all, my name is unusual. A lot of people thought that I made it up for the radio, that it was actually a radio name, but Bernie Wagenblast is the name that I've been called from when I was a very small child. So that was always part of it. I legally changed my first name to just Bernie. It was Bernard, which was the same name as my dad and my grandfather, a German name. But Bernie, I also realized, could be short for Bernadette. So I was fortunate that I had a name that could work either as a male or as a female. So I decided that at this point in my life, just legally changing it to Bernie made the most sense. I did that before I knew I was going to socially transition, and it presented no real problems with using Bernie as my legal first name. And like I say, I consider it short for Bernadette, although again, legally, it is actually just plain Bernie. Bernadette is the name I like to think of it being short for.
Yeah, I mean that's what I was thinking as well. Like Bernie it could be short for that, and it seems to you had the name already there, and it seems to work perfectly for you.
Yeah, yeah, it's a name that people tend to remember because it is so unusual. A lot of folks, this having worked in radio, will use radio names or air names. They try to take away the ethnicity of the name or just make it easier to roll off the tongue. One favorite is you take your middle name, you add an S to it, and
Right.
that's that's your new air name. I always wanted to keep Bernie Wagenblast as the name because I felt that it was different. It was unique. There were no other Bernie Wagenblasts on the radio or on TV, and I was the only one. And if I had, Bill Jones or something like that, there would have been a lot of Bill Joneses out there, and it wouldn't have necessarily stayed in anyone's memory after they heard it. But Bernie Wagenblast, that was a name that people tend to remember.
Yeah, somebody told me that once about Barmash. Like, oh, that's so unique. It didn't hit me the same. But yeah, I mean, yours is definitely that way. Like if somebody hears that, they'll remember that name. Before you even speak, they'll know here's Bernie Wagenblast with traffic and weather. Or traffic weather. Here's Bernie Wagenblast.
They actually have, I found this out a few years ago. There's a contest that apparently is run every year called the Name of the Year, where they will have a bunch of names, kind of like how they do March Madness, where you have the brackets and two teams play off, and then finally you have the championship. And somebody had submitted my name for that contest, so there were people that were voting around the country, around the world, maybe about whether my name should be the name of the year. I was eliminated in the first round, unfortunately, although I think some of the names that I was running up against were not people's real names. They were names that were made up, but it even got that kind of notoriety for being different.
Well, Bernie Wagenblast, we love the name and we think you're terrific. Thank you so much for joining me today and again for being so open and telling us how we got to where we are right now.
Well, thank you, Jerry, for having me on. It's always good to catch up with you. It's been a number of years since we've seen each other, but us folks who have been in the radio business, even if we're not currently in the radio business, there's that connection that I think we always have.
Absolutely. And I'm glad we can chat a little today. Always good to go down memory lane a little bit as well.
Indeed.
Thank you, Bernie.
All righty. Thanks, Jerry.
Thank you. Bernie Wagenblast. And if you have any ideas for who could join me on Here Now the News, send me an email at Here Now the News. That's Here Now the News, JB at gmail.com. And we will see you next time on the Here Now the News podcast. Thanks for watching.